weekend, and so for that, we're thankful for your traveling through and you're deciding to be with us. It's always good to meet Christians from far-off places. It's always good to unite our hearts and unite our voices together in unity whenever we come together to worship God. So certainly that is one of the joys this morning. We're going to get right into it this morning because we have quite a bit to cover, and it's obvious. That's usually code for this is going to be a very long sermon. I'm going to make it my goal for it not to be. But we will deal with a whole lot of information in a very compressed period of time. That's also slang for it's going to be a very long sermon. It's probably going to be long. Hopefully it won't feel long. But we'll deal with some concepts this morning that I think are necessary, especially in today's culture, as we discuss in a lot of ways the things that I think people view as being progressive. I think a lot of the things that are masked sometimes as false doctrine sometimes come across as progressivism. Sometimes people say, well, these are things that need to be happening. These are things that need to be taking place. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to take one of those concepts in specific and kind of isolate it down and ask ourselves, for our theme for the year, what does the Bible say about these things? And so that's what we're going to be doing this morning. A few years ago, a video made the rounds on Facebook or on YouTube depicting this woman, her name is Lauren King. She was a student at Lipscomb University. She was a senior at Lipscomb University who was hired on recently as a preaching intern at Franklin Drive Church of Christ. Now obviously that sends a whole lot of people's ears up because that made a whole lot of shockwaves, because universally across the span of Christianity, these are people that are quote-unquote members of Churches of Christ and not members of Churches of Christ, they viewed that as being something that was foreign. They viewed that as being something that was outside the norm. They viewed that as being something that was incredibly unorthodox. And there were people on both sides of this argument that viewed it very differently. Some people, as we just mentioned, hailed it as this idea of progressivism, that this is something that should be happening, this is something that needs to be embraced, and then asked the question, why hasn't this already happened? And there are other people on the other side, the more traditional side, that said, well, this should not be implemented in churches because it's against the biblical pattern. You can tell from my stance this morning where we stand on this issue. But when you look at this, and as Lauren King began to develop this, or began to go about this preaching intern, people began to flock from all over the place and interview her and say, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think about this new adventure that you're on, this new trailblazing activity that you're a part of? And Lauren King said very succinctly, it's been so encouraging to have men and women of older generations come to me and say, you are brave. That's kind of the motto for most progressivism today. Or come to me and say, my mom had the same gifts that you had, and she didn't get to use them. I'm glad that you get to, and things like that. The one phrase I want to key in on this whole thing is this phrase that she didn't get to use them. Because what Lauren King is voicing when she talks about this newfound adventure that she's in is that older people from other generations, more traditional generations, would come up to her and say, my parents didn't get to use this. My mother was a fantastic speaker. My aunt was a born leader. But because of the cultural constructs of the time, she didn't get to utilize those gifts. And so Lauren King, in saying this, viewed herself as being this kind of pioneer in this new avenue of women's rights amongst everything. And she viewed it as being this new kind of stage in all of this. Which leads me to the question, what does the Bible have to say about this? The one thing that we need to keep in mind as we look at this situation, you have no doubts about where we stand. We don't have any women teachers, we don't have any women public teachers in the auditorium, we don't have any women preachers. I'm the only preacher here, I'm not a woman. We don't have any women elders, we don't have any women deacons. So it's very clear where we stand on this. But the question really at hand is not where we stand on it, it's not what person X over here stands on it, it's where does the Bible stand on it? Because the one thing that we need to keep in mind is either this is something that needs to be pushed forward, either it is an actual good idea, and Lauren King is a pioneer of women's rights that needs to be championed, or this is something that falls directly in line or falls directly against biblical authority. And I think as we just talked about, we understand what side we're on at least this morning. One thing that we need to keep in mind as we go throughout the course of this study is that the Bible is not discriminatory. And that's something that people sometimes get confused. People sometimes think, well, the Bible is discriminating against women. It's discriminating against all different races. It's discriminating against women. And it doesn't really have their best interests at heart. And to that I would vehemently disagree with. Just because the Bible does not, quote unquote, I'm going to use this very, very tongue-in-cheek, just because the Bible does not agree with the cultural conditions of the day, does not mean by any stretch of imagination that it is wrong. Take a polar opposite doctrinal subject. I'm not trying to connect these two by any stretch of imagination, but take something like homosexuality. Homosexuality is one that has been for the last 30 or 40 years been pressed forward as a progressive issue that we need to champion equality amongst people of different orientations. That's something that we need to be pushing towards. And if for whatever reason you're against that, then you're just a bigot, you're not godly, you're not a good person, you just hate people in general. And yet when you look at the scriptures, the Bible is very plain on this subject. The Bible is very plain on the idea of a man and a woman for life. And we could branch off into the idea of adultery, and that also needs to be pressed forward as being something that needs to be dealt with right alongside homosexuality. But the point remains that just because culture embraces something like homosexuality does not mean that God does. And that's something that we really need to keep in mind. But just because God does not allow women to take a public authoritative viewpoint in the church does not mean that He hates them. It does not mean that He hates, and by the way, I'm saying them because I am a man. It does not mean that He hates women. It doesn't mean that He views them as second-class citizens. And that's something I really want to develop throughout the course of this lesson. It's just how God views women. Because when you look at the scriptures, He views them in a very, very positive light. And that's something oftentimes that falls under the radar of this. If you've been with us for any period of time, you know that we're in the middle of a long yearly theme. The yearly theme is, what does the Bible say about blank? We've discussed various topics such as baptism, the Lord's Supper, sola scriptura, using the Bible alone as our guide. What we're going to be looking at this morning is the idea of male leadership. And by proxy, the absence of female leadership underneath the authority of God. And so when we ask ourselves this question, we have to ask ourselves very honestly and very objectively, not what my opinion is, not what Joe's opinion is, not what Ken's opinion is, but what does the Bible say about this? And quite frankly, very easily right here at the beginning, we can delineate the fact that the Bible is very clear that elders and deacons need to be male. Now, I'm putting this out there. When we talk about authoritative positions of leadership, the Bible is very clear that both of these offices need to be male. And some people will say, well, I don't view deacons as being positions of leadership. They are authoritative. And if you disagree with me, just ask yourself the simple question, would you put a woman as a deacon? And if the answer is no, then you also view it as authoritative, at least on some level. And so the Bible is very clear on at least these two subjects. First and foremost, because when you deal with elders, the Bible says in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, an overseer then must be above reproach and the husband of one wife. Is the second qualification that it throws out there. The fact that he says, that Paul says in this letter to Timothy, that an overseer must be the husband of one wife, takes into effect or assumes the idea that he's going to be male in the first place. And that since he's going to be male, he also needs to be married. He also needs to be the husband of only one wife. There's a whole lot of layers to that we can unpack that we're not going into this morning. But he says virtually the same thing in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12 about deacons, saying also that deacons need to be the husband of one wife. Now, some people would argue with this. They would say, well, the reason that he's really saying the husbands of one wife thing is the fact that if you're going to be a deacon, if you're going to be male, then you need to be married. But that doesn't jive at all. When you look at the scriptures, when you look at especially the idea of deacons, he doesn't ever say, and if you're going to be male, these are the qualifications you're going to have, and if you're going to be female, these are the qualifications you need to have. Because specifically within the idea of deacons, if you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, he breaks off from talking about the male qualifications of the deacon to talk about their wives. And those are totally different qualifications. And some people would say, well, those are the qualifications for the female deacons. When in reality, every single translation, if you were to look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, if you were to look at every single translation that mentions the idea of women in that passage, renders it wives, except for the New International Version, which also annihilates verses on baptism and all sorts of other things. The one argument that seems to pop up a lot when we discuss the idea of elders and deacons being wives, the two women specifically. The first one is Deborah. Jump back to Judges chapter 4, if you would. Judges chapter 4. Deborah is a little known, even though she shouldn't be, at least in my opinion. But Deborah is a person in Scripture that oftentimes flies on the radar because we don't usually give her the credit that she deserves. And in Judges chapter 4, starting in verse 4, this is the story. Of course, we understand that judges were given to redeem Israel from the different people that they had been kind of enslaved to. They had fallen into iniquity. They had been taken captive, or they had been afflicted by various people. Judges were sent to deliver them. And Deborah was one of these people. Judges chapter 4, starting verse 4, it says, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. And she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. Now she sent and summoned Barak the son of Abonam from Kadesh Naphtali and said to him, Behold, the Lord the God of Israel has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali, from the sons of Zebulun, and I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots, with his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand. Listen to verse 8, because this is important to understanding this story. Verse 8, Barak said to her, If you will go with me, then I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. She said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be to yours on the journey you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Which, by the way, if you were to keep reading Judges chapter 4, you would see the very unique way in which a woman annihilates Sisera. That's a story for a different time also. Then Deborah, verse 8, arose, went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak called Zebulun, Naphtali together to Kadesh. With 10,000 went up with him, and Deborah also went up with him. The argument that many people take when they look at this idea of male leadership, specifically with an organized capacity, which you can argue that Deborah is absolutely a part of. The argument comes into line, well, Deborah was a woman, she was in a position of authority, and so therefore we can also have women of authority within our local congregations. Two things that need to be taken in mind with this. The first is, this is under the old law. This is something that is totally different from today's world. I know that sounds like a cop-out. But it's the exact same argument that we make in large part in regards to musical instruments. When you look throughout this book of the Psalms, you see over and over and over again harps, you see lyres, you see string instruments, all these different things used. The one defining factor is that that is in the Old Testament and that we are under a completely new covenant in the New Testament. It's entirely two different things. The second thing, this is the big thing that I want us to look at least for our purposes this morning, is when you look at Deborah's role in Judges chapter 4, if you look at the text closely, what you'll notice is that the original plan was for Barak to lead. And Deborah was merely a prophetess going towards Barak and telling him, you need to take the army of God out and redeem these people. Barak hesitated. And because Barak hesitated, he said, I will only go if you go with me. And so what you in essence have in Judges chapter 4 is not Deborah holding up this Amazonian warrior princess sword where she leads the people in a charge against the wicked infidels. This is Deborah and Barak working together in close concert to defeat the enemies of God. Where do you see this also on a much, much lower scale, or at least a much less intense scale? The story of Priscilla and Aquila, whenever they converted. Husband and wife, or man and woman, working in tandem as they accomplishes the purposes of God. This is another story. This is actually one that I've gotten into an argument with one person specifically over the last couple of years. This is the person of Phoebe. I was talking to somebody one time about the idea about our church here in Hillside, and he said, well, at Hillside you don't have men and women leaders, or you don't have men and women elders or deacons or preachers, do you? I said, no, we don't. And he pointed me to this person. I'd always heard about Phoebe. I never given it much thought. He said, what do you do with Phoebe? What do you do with Phoebe, who is very blatantly labeled in Romans chapter 16 as being a deaconess? Look at that in Romans chapter 16. Romans chapter 16. What Paul does, in essence, in this chapter is lay out a big thank you or a big hello to basically everybody in the world that he knows. It can seem like he's name-dropping at times, but we don't know these people, so it's okay. Romans chapter 16, though, is a huge list of all the people that he wants to say thank you to. And in Romans chapter 16, starting in verse 1, he says, I commend you to our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church was at Cenchrea, that you might receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and that you help her in a manner whatever she may have need of you, for she herself has also been a helper of many, and of myself as well. Phoebe is listed, and depending on which translation you read, Phoebe is listed in Romans chapter 16 and verse 1, in my translation, as being a helper. And if you were to do a full translation list of every single translation, that's exactly the same word that you would see in every translation, except once again, the New American Standard Version. The New American Standard Version, or I'm sorry, New International Version, not the New American Standard Version. That's the best one, personally speaking. The New International Version is the one that lists Phoebe in Romans chapter 16 and verse 1 as being a deaconess. But if you look at the NIV, as we mentioned a second ago, the NIV is also the same one. And this isn't a slam on anybody that necessarily has the NIV, just trying to open our eyes to this concept. The NIV is also the one that completely annihilates 27 verses out of your New Testament. Primarily verses speaking such things as baptism, things such as repentance. And so it may be as you're reading your NIV, as you're going throughout the scriptures, you may find yourself at verse 3, and the next verse will be verse 5. And that's just the way the NIV lists it. But the NIV, because it's consistently ranked one of the top 3 major translations that nearly everybody uses, at least in the world, Romans chapter 16, verse 1 obviously picks up in people's minds as saying, well, she's a deaconess, it's a formal position, and so therefore women can be deacons in the church. When you look at that word deaconess, and that is, and I will give them this credit, when you look at that word that's used in Romans chapter 16 as deaconess, it comes from the same word that we use deacon from. But that word deacon needs to be pointed out that it is used 29 times in 27 verses, and 26 of those 29 times it is used to denote a servant or a minister of some capacity. By the way, in John chapter 2 and verse 5, whenever Mary, the mother of Jesus, talks to the household servants to get them to fill up the water pots that Jesus is then going to turn into wine, the people that she is talking to are the same word, diakonos. It's the same exact word that we get deacons from. And so you have to ask yourself this question. When you look at Phoebe in Romans chapter 16 verses 1 and 2, is she fulfilling some kind of official capacity? And the truth of the matter is no. Because when you look at these 2 verses, when you see the explicit capacity that she served, being not only a benefit to the church at Rome, but also being a benefit to Paul himself, who was in Corinth at this point, she could not have been an official deacon of the church at Rome purely because of her transitory nature, the fact that she seemed to be everywhere. And the reason that she was such a great help to Paul most likely was because she was the one that bore the letter to Rome. Now that does not mean that she spoke the letter in Rome, but it does mean that she delivered the letter to Rome and then verified its credentials, being witness whenever Paul wrote it in the first place. So the argument that sometimes people make about Phoebe and Deborah is, well, these are 2 women who were in official capacities, and so therefore give us the pattern to have women in official capacities as well. I don't think it's coincidence. This is a slight deviation. But I don't think it's a coincidence that when you look at the 12 sons of Israel, all 12 sons in a sort of way got an inheritance, but died in it. And when you look at the people that Jesus chose to be his 12 apostles, he chose 12 people, and there were many women that followed. But all 12 apostles were men. Now, could he have chosen a woman that was better than at least one of them, being Judas? Yeah, probably. That doesn't change the fact that he chose men exclusively for those types of roles. And that should tell us something. When you look specifically at the text, though, there's 2 verses primarily that denote this idea of men leadership. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14. You don't want to look there, it's up on the screen. Although this is size 32 font, so I don't know if everyone can see it. My incredibly awful vision oftentimes cannot. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, though. Listen to what Paul is saying here. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, starting in verse 33. Actually, we'll start in verse 30. Yeah, 33. 1 Corinthians 14, starting in verse 33. Paul writes, "For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints." That is very important to understand this section. Verse 34, "The women are to keep silent in churches, but they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. For if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Was it from you that the word of God first went forth? Or has it come to you only?" There are many people that take 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 33 through 36, and blanket it across everything and say, bar none, a woman should not speak ever, no matter what. If you are in the assembly of God, you close your mouth and you do not open it until you leave this room. That's a very rude way of putting what they say very blatantly. I do not agree with that concept. I do not agree with that concept in the least. Because the major question when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14, if you view it in terms of an absolute silence, the one question that comes to mind is, how is a woman going to aim in a prayer? How is a woman going to fulfill the commandments of Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3 by lifting up their voices in praise if it denotes this absolute total silence by all women everywhere? That's not what he's addressing. What Paul is addressing in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is not a blanket silence amongst all women everywhere. What he's addressing is a relative silence. And we'll revisit this concept here in a second. But he's addressing a relative silence that women are supposed to have in the assembly. The main issue that Paul is dealing with here in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, starting in chapter 12 and going through chapter 14, is this idea of order when it comes to spiritual gifts. And specifically in chapter 14, when he arrives at the idea of tongues and the interpretation of tongues, one of the things that he's addressing is how people are talking all over the place. And this person has a tongue, this person has an interpretation, and everybody's just kind of talking at large. And what Paul addresses a little bit here in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 through 36, is to keep the order of everything. This is the way it has to be. And he builds on the natural order of this idea as he not only talks about in this chapter, in chapter 11, but also in the next verse, which is in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and starting in verse 8. Flip over there with me if you would. He knew we were eventually going to get to this verse. There's no way we were going to end today without talking about it. 1 Timothy chapter 2, if you've read any type of religious headlines lately, 1 Timothy chapter 2 has been marked by almost every religious group, and certainly every secular group, as being misogynistic, as being hate-filled, and as being incredibly divisive and just despicable in all different types of ways. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, though, I want to look at what he's talking about. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 8. Paul writes, "Therefore I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension." Likewise, verse 9, "I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly, discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, rather by means of good works. This is proper for women making inclined to godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." Verse 13, "For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. But women will be preserved for the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint." As I read that passage, you can almost hear and feel the collective heads of every feminist in the world just exploding. Because the world hates 1 Timothy chapter 2. Because what it seems like Paul is talking about is not only incredibly discriminatory, but it's just downright rude. And when we address this subject, and this is something I talked to Melina about when both of us were vertical this week, earlier in the week, when I was addressing this subject with her, I told her that I have a really hard time speaking on this subject because it is so inflammatory. And by very nature of what we're talking about, a man talking about this thing, it can come off as a man standing up here and saying, "I'm a man in a position of some authority, and I'm now telling every woman in here why they do not have the same authority that I do." And that can come off as very weird. It can come off as very awkward. And the last thing I want to do by any stretch of imagination as we delve into this topic, specifically within the confines of 1 Timothy chapter 2, is to come across demeaning, is to come across discriminatory. The only thing I care about, by all accounts, is by being 100% biblical as we approach this subject. And in 1 Timothy chapter 2, it opens up very simply in verses 8 and 9 by talking about the two drastically different roles that both women and men possess. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 7, he talks about the nature of men praying everywhere, lifting up holy hands, this kind of grand idea of raising their voices and raising their hearts in worship towards God. But then he immediately transitions in verses 8 and 9 to talk about the role of women. And what he immediately delves into when he talks about 8, 9, 10, what he immediately delves into is not the role of women in churches, but the role of women in modesty at large. And what he's addressing here is the idea that the main thing that women should be focusing their minds on is not these grand statements of display or beauty, but on the things that really matter in this world, the things of the heart. This is one of those passages that is called, if you're familiar with the term, this is one of those passages that is called a not-but passage. He's not describing this, but he is describing this. That's kind of the way he talks about it. And so when he says, I'm not saying that they should braid their hair or have costly pearls, he's not saying don't get dressed up. That's not what he's addressing. He's saying don't focus your attention on that, but focus your attention on these things. It's not a sin for a woman to wear pearls, by any stretch of imagination. It would be nice if it was. It would save me thousands every year in jewelry. But it's not. Actually, hundreds. Sorry about that. Lena's watching at home, so I can't make that up. That's not what he's addressing here. What he is addressing here is that that isn't what women should be focusing on. It should be the hidden person of the heart. That's where real charm, that's where real beauty is found. If you were to look back in Roman culture, especially in the time that Paul is dealing with, because keep in mind, he's addressing, especially in Corinth, people that are incredibly carnal. Women in this day and time period, I'm sure men to a certain extent, I don't mean to exclude them, but women in this time period would spend, and were known for spending hours getting ready. Please keep the comments to a minimum. They would spend hours getting ready. And I'm not talking about trying on 5 different sets of clothes. This is where I have to balance the line between not being rude and trying not to make jokes. But women were known to spend, especially in Corinth, from the hours of about 6 to 12 getting ready, not only by themselves, but having their household servants helping them get ready. And contrary to current day trends, where a woman would try to tan themselves to make it look like they were out in the sun, a woman in that time period would try to make her face as white as possible. Because the ideal in that day was you didn't have to go outside if you didn't want to. That denoted luxury. That denoted opulence. That denoted wealth. And so women, not only in addition to putting on the standard makeup, would spend hours powdering their face, making sure every aspect of their body was white to show that you never had to go outside and do work. Because that was for the lower classes. And then to emulate the upper classes, they would spend hours putting on jewelry. They would spend hours finding the right clothing. And they would go out and they would say, does all this make me look a higher social class than I actually am? And that's really what Paul is addressing here. Because in their pursuit to put on all these different things, they were trying to elevate themselves physically rather than spiritually. And so what Paul is addressing with the idea of modesty is, none of those things matter. The only thing that truly matters is whether or not you're living for God. Submission, humility, kindness, gentleness, reverence, those things are the things that are worth highlighting. Those things are the things that are worth denoting in your life. Rather than pearls and clothing, all those things that simply go away. And as Paul digs into this discussion, talking about submission, he goes to talk about the idea of women having the idea of modesty, women adorning themselves rightfully. And then he goes straight into, if you look in verses 12 and 13, if memory serves right, if you look in verses 12 and 13, that's where he brings up the idea of Eve. And Eve is the flashpoint for this chapter. Because what Paul addresses when he brings up Eve is a very sore part in human history. Because remember, both people fell. Adam and Eve both fell. But what Paul is addressing is a flashpoint of human history. But he highlights it on the women by saying that it was Eve who was deceived first and then transgressed, or then deceived mankind. And so immediately feminists look at that and they say, well, you're saying in essence that women are more volatile, more emotional, more subject to that type of trickery. And I don't think that's what Paul is going into at all. I want to point out one thing that oftentimes goes underdeveloped or underutilized in this whole chapter, and that's the fact that in both Corinthians and in Timothy, Paul even mentions the fact that women need to learn at all. Now that sounds very sarcastic, and that sounds very superfluous. But in a day and age when mankind hardly ever reached a third grade education, and women, unless they were extraordinarily wealthy, learned nothing, at least in a formal sense. The fact that Paul is addressing the fact that women need to learn anything at all is incredibly progressive for that time period. So for people that are making the argument here that he's addressing some kind of cultural concern, Paul is doing nothing of that. The farthest thing from Paul's mind is culture concerns. Number one, by basing the fact that women need to have a spiritual education in the first place, and then by taking this moment in time and shooting it 3,000 years back and bringing Eve as the basis for his argument. There's no culture in regards to this. There's no cultural argument to be made here. And when he throws it back to Eve and says, Eve was deceived first, and then mankind, he's not talking about how Eve is just more susceptible to that. What he's describing here over and over and over and over again is the idea of the natural order of things. When you look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, read this section again with me. When you look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 11, he mentions a woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, which is, by the way, we just talked about entirely progressive at that time. Verse 12, but I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over men, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve, and it was not Eve, Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. You know the one verse that everyone skips over in that whole argument? We look at 14, and we look at 12, and we totally ignore verse 13. When in reality, verse 13 is the basis for his entire argument. Because when you think about what Paul is addressing here in this passage, he's not basing his entire argument on the trickery and the deceit of Eve. That's in view, sure. But his entire argument is based in verse 13. When it says that Adam was created first, and then Eve. Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, if you would. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 talks about the same type of idea. And this is in a little bit of a different context, it's slightly similar, because he discusses the ever so volatile issue of head coverings that certain groups in certain parts of the world argue about all day, every day. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 1, Paul writes, "Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything, and hold firmly to the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand," verse 3, "that Christ is the head of every man, and man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ." And then in verse 4, he launches off into the discussion about head coverings. What Paul discusses in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and builds off of 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 13 is the natural order of creation. God created the world, and then he created man. And then he created woman out of man. And so his whole basis for discussing this in 1 Timothy chapter 2 is not necessarily to discuss the trickery of woman, although that's certainly in view, but to describe the natural order of things. That this is the way that authority is supposed to rank in a formal sense. This is the way it's supposed to go about. And when you look at the trickery of Eve there in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 14, that happened because she tried to supplant that natural order of authority. And the time that it happened, it was just destroyed almost everything. No doubt what Paul had in mind too as he deals with this church, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, most likely of Ephesus. What he's addressing here is this Gnostic viewpoint that men and women are 100% equal in everything, and that women need to throw off their cultural bounds and rise up and overtake man. Which borders, by the way, on third wave feminism that started in the 80s, which is a completely different thing than first and second wave feminism, which fought for women's rights. But this third wave feminism that tries to seek up and tries to overthrow mankind, what Paul's addressing in 1 Timothy chapter 2 is it's not the way it's supposed to be. There has to be a natural order of things. One of the greatest parallels that you can find to this in all of Scripture is found within the Levitical priesthood. When God is authorizing the tribes, and he puts all the different tribes in the various places, he chooses the tribe of Levi to be the one that's supposed to delegate the temple. Now, surely there were other people in other tribes that could have done much better than some of the Levites could. It doesn't make them inferior in any way, simply because God chose the Levites as the ones for ministry to the temple. It just means that there has to be some kind of order. If everyone's ministering to the temple, if everyone's taking different roles, if everyone is doing everything, then in essence nothing gets done. I don't believe that he's talking about necessarily the trickery, that women are prone to deception, women are prone to false teaching, because in Titus chapter 2 verses 4 through 5, what does Paul advocate women doing? Teaching other women. So why, if women were prone to deception, if women were prone to deceiving other people, why would he then turn around in Titus and say that women need to be teaching other women? The whole thing that he's addressing from start to finish is the natural order of things. The natural order of God. And that's what he's addressing in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 13 through 14. This brings up the ever-present hard verse in verse 15. Because Paul says in verse 15, women will be preserved from bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. Be the first person to tell you I don't understand everything about that verse. I've heard some things about that verse that are very good. I've heard some things about that verse that are very evil. But I think in essence what he's doing is cycling back to that same idea of modesty that he touched on right there at the beginning, providing those bookends, the two parts of this. We tend to sometimes when we look at this passage, and I think when we look at the idea of male leadership versus female leadership, we tend to think of it in terms of better or worse. And as we look throughout the course of this, the last thing I want us to look at is in terms of one is better and the other is worse. That's not the way that I think we need to look at it. Because we all know, and I've become infinitely more aware of this ever since I got married, and please nobody amen that statement. But I've become infinitely more aware of the fact that a good woman can make a very mediocre or a sub-average man infinitely better. And by the same token, there are some great men that are floored and brought down to the depths of by women that are not above average. Women that are so What we tend to underutilize and what we tend to underappreciate is the role that women play within our homes. And it's very easy to think to ourselves, this is just nothing more than a consolation prize. No, you don't get to preach, at least in a formal sense. No, at least you don't get to be an elder, but at least you get to stay home. That's not what I'm talking about. Because I'll be the first person to tell you that as the home goes, so the family goes. And so the family goes, so the church goes, so the country goes, so everything goes. And if the family unit isn't of itself decrepit, if it's bankrupt, then that family will be useless. We value things for whatever reason based on their prominence in the world, and not based on their proper utilization towards God. I have nothing against, and I've always said this and I'll always say this, I have nothing against women having jobs outside the home. I would be a hypocrite. Melina worked as a teacher for 2 years. I have nothing against women having jobs outside the home. I have nothing against men having jobs outside the home, provided neither of them neglect their responsibilities to the home. That's actually the big thing that needs to be brought forward to look at all these passages. There's a picture that surfaced over the course of the Harvey illustration of the harvest stories over the last week. This is a picture I hadn't seen before, but I think it's very telling. Because when you look at this picture, what you see is something very simple. You see a guy that's carrying a woman that's just walking out of the water. And it seems very simple. But one blogger who I won't name mentioned something that I thought was very pointed about this picture. He pointed out that this is the way in reality life should work. You have this strong, strapping SWAT team member that is carrying a woman who in turn is carrying a child. Now, could that woman carry the SWAT team member? I don't know, maybe. Could the man carry the child? Probably. But none of that would function nearly as well. That's what you see played out before. We tend to value or undervalue women's place because it doesn't seem to have a public formal perception. But I'll be the first person to tell you that the value of a woman is greater than anything else on earth. And if you disagree with me, read what Solomon has to say in Proverbs chapter 31. Women get their whole chapter devoted to simply how awesome they are. And how a good woman is more valued than rubies and gold and more than anything else in this earth. And those of us with fantastic lives will attest every single word of this. We need to start utilizing women. We need to start valuing women in the same way that God does. And not look simply to the formal public perception and say, well, they're less than human because they don't beat behind the pulpit. That is, of all the things in this world, 0.00001% that matters. The thing that matters is their contribution to the family, just as the husband matters to the family, and their contribution to God. With that in mind, that's what I want to close with this morning. I hope it wasn't too volatile. I hope it wasn't too crazy. I hope it was strictly biblical. That's all I care about. But the one thing that we haven't talked about is what someone needs to do in order to become a child of God. If you're here this morning for whatever reason, you are not a Christian, you have this moment. And I want to let this picture sit up here for a minute while I'm talking about this because you never know when you won't have that moment. You'll never know when you won't have a moment to be baptized, to confess your sins, to come forward, professing His name, to bow the knee to Him, to put Him on for God's baptism. 2 weeks ago, people in Houston thought, yeah, we'll get a little bit of rain. That'll be the end of it. This week, thousands of people have lost their homes. Some have even lost their lives. How many people prepare for something like that? The last thing I want to leave you with, or you to do this morning is leave you unprepared and unbragged. If we can help with that anyway, won't you come?
Wonderful story of love. Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above.